Hello everyone, and welcome once again to Caleb Likes Books. Today I am doing another book review for you, and that is for I Am Not a Serial Killer by Dan Wells. This is the first book in the John Cleaver series, which is made up of two trilogies. This is one of the more popular Dan Wells books. I've been interested in reading some books by Mr. Wells for quite some time because he is a good friend of Brandon Sanderson's, who, if you've been watching my channel, you probably know. Brandon Sanderson is, at the moment, my favorite author. Love everything the guy has put out that I've read. And he's good friends with Dan Wells, has been for a long time, and they do a podcast together called the Intentionally Blank Podcast, which I love. I listen to it whenever a new episode comes out, and I think that Dan, in that podcast, comes across as a very likable person. I really enjoy listening to him talk, and for a long time I've been interested in reading some of his books because of that, and also because he's soon going to start writing for the Cosmere. And so I wanted to read some of his own works just to kind of get a feel for what his writing was like. Plus, I had heard some good things about his books. And I chose this one because it seemed like the best place to start. I think it was his first published novel, and it's one that out of his book seems to get the most praise. So I decided to check it out, and it's one that I've been looking forward to for a long time, and I had quite high expectations for. But even, I think, with that, I think my expectations were met and even exceeded, because I enjoyed this book a lot more than I expected to, and I expected to enjoy it quite a bit, but I think I enjoyed it even more than I expected. So lots of good things to say about this book, which I am going to start talking about now. So first things first, the premise of this book, which I do really enjoy, is this book follows a 15-year-old, I believe, named John Wayne Cleaver. Now, John is a teenager, obviously, who has sociopathic tendencies, he has rules in place that he has set for himself that will keep him from harming other people or engaging too much in those sociopathic stuff going on with him. So for example, if I can think of them off the top of my head, if he notices that he has been watching somebody too closely or too often, he has to completely ignore them for a week to try to get himself to stop doing that. Anytime that he starts, he's talking to someone and he gets really angry at them and starts getting that urge to do very bad things to them, he has to force himself to compliment them. Things like that. Different rules that he has in place to keep what he calls the monster at bay, basically. Which was really interesting. So he's the main character of this book, and he's very interested in serial killers. He obviously, in some ways shares a lot of mentality with what serial killers might have, but he also is just very interested in them, and he reads a lot about them and all this stuff. So then when a serial killer shows up in his hometown, he takes a lot of interest in that. And because of his interest in serial killers, because his mentality is so similar to what a serial killer might be, all this stuff, he starts to try to figure out who the serial killer is and what they're doing and why they're doing it and all this stuff. So he kind of becomes a detective of sorts, trying to figure out what's going on. Which is a really interesting premise for several reasons. First of all, just the idea of this guy who is going around killing people, and the main character trying to figure that out is interesting in and of itself. It kind of reminded me a bit of the TV show Criminal Minds, which is actually one of my favorite shows. My wife and I watch it together quite often, where you kind of really try to get into the mentality of the killer, or whoever it is that's doing bad things, and trying to figure them out. And this struck me very similarly, which is probably a big reason why I enjoyed it so much. And then in addition to that, you also have the main character, who themselves is a sociopath, who has these mental things going on, who first of all has an interesting voice and interesting perspective, but also is then able to use that knowledge of, well, this is how I am, to then apply that to the killer. So a very interesting premise for several reasons, and I think it was a really good mix of, using those aspects of John's character to further the story. To talk a bit more about John, I really enjoyed John. He is a character who is obviously a bit disturbing at times because of the stuff that he has going on, but he is also really charming, actually, and kind of charismatic, even though he kind of, you know, says a lot of times like he's not a very social person. People don't really like to be around him, all this stuff. You know, reading from his voice, as disturbing as it could be sometimes, was also interesting, and I enjoyed, you know, getting to know him as a character and seeing the way that he handles his sociopathic tendencies and how he tries to, you know, kind of keep that, you know, make sure that that doesn't come out too much, and all that stuff was really interesting. And he's just a pretty likable protagonist in general, even though he has that stuff going on. Other characters in this book were good too. You also have his mother, who, you know, obviously is very prevalent in this book, who very clearly is concerned about some of the stuff going on with him, but also, you know, is very much trying to help him. His friend Max, who I think was really interesting, and I enjoyed the dynamic that Max and John both had together. Not Max's therapist, John's therapist, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, but I really enjoyed their interactions. I especially really enjoyed the therapy scenes, because then you can really, you know, throughout the whole book you can get into John's head, but I feel like in those scenes especially you can really get into his head and see what he's thinking, and seeing how he bounces off of his therapist and how they kind of trade ideas back and forth. And then you also have the Crowley couple, Mr. and Mrs. Crowley, who are all also really good. Just generally a lot of the character stuff in this book was really good, but obviously the standout is John himself, who just has a really interesting perspective. I really enjoyed reading from his point of view, and that was one of my favorite parts of this book. Some other good stuff in here. I just loved the mystery aspect to it, and the stuff in this book that really just kind of made me want to keep reading more, which I will probably have a spoiler section later in this video, because I can't talk about too much of it without getting into spoilers. But John initially trying to figure out who the killer is, and that actually is resolved pretty early on in the book, like a quarter or a third of the way through. He finds out, you know, he figures out who is the killer. So then the rest of the book is all about him trying to stop the killer from continuing to kill, and trying to figure out how he can expose him and get him to, you know, either, you know, take out the killer or hand him over to the police or whatever it may be. Which was all really interesting. Seeing him initially trying to figure it out was really interesting. Seeing him then trying to figure out, you know, why the killer was doing what he's doing, and what exactly is going on with that. All that stuff was really interesting. Again, I'll probably talk a bit more about that later in the video. And again, this book was just generally a really interesting one to read. It really kept me going. The one thing that I mentioned on my Twitter as I was reading this, because I typically, you know, will kind of tweet out my thoughts as I'm reading a book sometimes. One thing that I said was like, this is definitely one of those, you know, you're reading it and you get to the end of a chapter and you're like, I should probably go do something else, but I'll read one more chapter. You know, I can fit another more chapter into my day. And that happened to me over and over and over again reading this book. I think I finished this book in 2 or 3 sessions because I was just that into it. And it just really kept me going, and I was always very interested in the next thing that was going to happen. Now, in terms of negatives, I don't really have anything to say with this book because I did really, really love it a lot overall. I will maybe touch on a couple of more things as I get into spoilers, because I can't really talk about them without spoiling the book. And they're not even negatives, they're just things I might like to see. So that basically means right now we're going to start talking spoilers, because I've said basically everything that is non-spoiler that I want to say. So if you don't want to be spoiled on this book, which I would highly recommend going into this book not knowing spoilers, because it's just very interesting to discover all that yourself, then do not watch this part of the video. I will have timestamps in the description so you can skip ahead to my final thoughts. So getting into spoilers now, last chance to leave. So Mr. Crowley was the killer, which was an interesting twist, one that I didn't see coming mostly. I did see it coming in the scene where it's revealed, where Mr. Crowley picks up the guy that he wants to go fishing with, and the book is very obviously trying to make you think that the guy he's picking up is the killer. But then as that scene was going on, I was like, wait, no, that's what he's trying to make you think. So it's actually going to be Mr. Crowley, and then it was. It was an interesting twist, and where it was revealed so early on in the book is something that I actually really liked, because then, the mystery of who is the killer was interesting, but then having that dynamic of John constantly interacting with Mr. Crowley, and trying to kind of keep up the facade of, oh, I don't actually know that he's up to anything, I don't want to let him on, knowing that I know what he's doing. But then also, trying to figure out why he's doing what he's doing, and trying to figure out if he can actually take him down or whatever, was also very interesting. And I think that revealing who the killer was early on was a very smart move in order to let that part of the story kind of take its place. And I also really enjoyed the end of this book as things went along, and I really enjoyed the way that John went about things. He would leave little notes for Mr. Crowley throughout the book, kind of letting him know, obviously trying to cover his tracks, but being like, I know who you are, I know what you're doing. That was really interesting, and seeing how Mr. Crowley then reacted to that, and finding out that he needed to replace his own body parts in order to continue to survive was really interesting. Again, kind of similar to the original reveal that he was the killer, I kind of figured out that he was going to use his wife against him, because although I didn't know to the extent that it would happen, I had an idea of it. But when he said like his weakness is love, he very obviously cares about his wife, like actually cares and all that stuff, I was like, he's going to use her against him somehow. And I at first was thinking maybe he's going to actually do something to his wife to get through to him, which is actually what ended up happening. But I didn't actually expect that to happen, because I was really hoping that John would not go that far in this book, but he did, and that was a very interesting scenario, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, because I actually have some more thoughts on that, but it's part of a different train of thought, so yeah. But the rest of the ending I thought was really interesting, where John was basically responsible for the death of his therapist because Mr. Crowley got to him. That was really interesting, added a lot of stakes for John personally that I really enjoyed, and just the ending of the book in general was really good. And now I'll start talking about that one thing that I mentioned that I would have liked to see, which is not a negative for me, because it did not actively detract from my enjoyment of this book. But it is something that I would have liked to see, and something that I was hoping would be in the book, but it wasn't. But I don't count it as a negative, because I still enjoyed the book regardless. This didn't really affect my enjoyment of it. It's just something that I might have liked to see, which is added consequences for John. Which you can certainly argue that he definitely had some consequences, where he called his therapist, and then because of that his therapist got killed. So obviously there are consequences for his actions. The stuff with Max, his falling out with Max, all that stuff. He put his mother in danger at the end, all that stuff. Very, very clearly does have consequences, but I'm thinking, at the end, him basically attacking Mrs. Crowley, I think should have maybe had some more consequences to it. I feel like the fact that it was so easy to cover up, not necessarily easy to cover up, but everything worked out in just such a way that the police never caught on to him, I think it would have been interesting to see him actually face more consequences for that. Granted, that probably would have gone very poorly for him, but I think that might have been an interesting angle to go for, and maybe that does happen later in the series. I haven't read it, obviously, so I don't know. Another thing is, in terms of consequences, I think it would have been really interesting if Crowley had figured out that John was onto him. There were several points in this book where it was going through like the little notes that John would leave, and I thought for sure, because that was something that he did so often, I thought for sure that eventually Crowley was going to leave a letter for him and say, "I know you're onto me," or something like that. Which then would have added an interesting dynamic, because there are very few situations where John and Mr. Crowley are actually alone. Usually either Crowley's wife is with him or John's mother is with them or something like that. So then you could have had a dynamic of both of them kind of knowing what the other one is up to, but having to have this facade of friendliness between the two of them. which I think would have been interesting. Again, not something that I'm, you know, considering a negative because it didn't take away from my enjoyment. It's just something I thought might have been an interesting direction to go with the story. So let me know down in the comments if you thought that might have been an interesting thing to do with this story, because I think it might have been. So that is pretty much it that I have to talk about, so no more spoilers from this point onward. I really enjoyed this book. It is one of my favorite books that I have read this year, I think, which I didn't expect going in. I figured I would probably enjoy it, but I didn't expect it to be absolute favorite material. It's hard for me to say if this is a top 5 book of the year for me, because there have been some stellar books that I've read this year, but I would not be surprised at all if this ends up at least in my top 10 for the end of the year. So I really enjoyed this book a lot. As far as a rating that I would give it, I would feel comfortable giving this a 10 out of 10. I really don't have any issues with it. I loved it from beginning to end, like I said, just constantly had to keep reading it, was always, even, I don't tend to think about books a lot when I'm not reading them. Sometimes I do, you know, some of my favorites, I'll finish reading them for, you know, whatever period of time, and then, you know, I'll be at work or something, and I'll be just doing, you know, manual labor, doing whatever, and so my mind will wander, and I'll just be thinking of, oh, but what about this thing and this thing from the book, and trying to theorize on where things are gonna go, or thinking about the characters or whatever. That doesn't happen to me a whole lot with books for some reason. It probably does for other people, but for me it just doesn't. Typically when I'm reading, I am just focused on that, and when I'm not reading, I'm focused on other things. But this book was just constantly in my mind for the couple of days that I was reading it, because like I said, I got through it really quickly. But it was constantly in my mind as I was reading it, and I was just super into it, constantly thinking about it, constantly wondering about it, wondering where things were gonna go, all that stuff. And so I just really enjoyed it overall. It was absolutely fantastic, and would highly recommend checking it out if it sounds interesting to you. So that is pretty much it for this video. Let me know down in the comments if you have read I Am Not a Serial Killer and the rest of the John Cleaver books. Like I said, there's 2 trilogies. Right now there's 6 books in total. I don't know if there will be any more, but right now there are 6 books. So let me know if you have read any of the other ones and what you thought of them and how you think this one compares. Or if you've just read this one, let me know what you thought of it. So that is pretty much it for this video. So thank you all for watching, and I will see you guys next time.